Good evening. Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Sharon in New Jersey, Yehuda in South Carolina, Carla in Brazil, Bill in Mid-Missouri, Joe in the Inland Empire, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Lucy in Minnesota. Paul has got popcorn. I love it. The other Paul in Chicago. Joseph in Massachusetts. Ella says shalom, Eve in Florida. Spencer in Hartford, Connecticut. I'm going to stop that. Nina, the car is ready, but I'll be teaching the class, so I guess we'll just pick it up tomorrow. When your teachers are a family, mom and pop shop, you got stuff like this. Our nest is no longer empty. Our daughter is home. Our son is back from camp. It's a full house. Great to be with you. Our daf is page 80. All right, daf pay. And we are going to be picking this up on 79b. We're working our way through chapter 8 today, starting with Mishna number 5 here in Tractate Gittin. Generally speaking, the laws of divorce. And we're not digressing so much lately. We're actually covering the laws of divorce. And you might have thought that the material we'll be covering today would have come up earlier in our journey about this tractate, but of course the sages always begin with the questions that they found more interesting earlier in the tractate. And now we're really getting into the nuts and bolts of what is a get, what must be written in the get so that it is a valid get. The stakes are very high. If the couple makes a mistake and they rely on an inadequate, failed, mistaken, damaged, improper get, then the couple might think they're divorced when they're not. Since a husband by Torah law can have more than one wife, if he marries thinking remarries thinking he's divorced and he's not, it's not the end of the world for him because he can have two wives. But a wife can only have one husband. And of course, by rabbinic law for the last 1,000 years, there's no polygamy. But at any rate, but a wife who remarries thinking that she's divorced when she's not, this is a disaster because that second marriage is not a marriage. And in fact, it's a licentious union, licentious intercourse. And an adulterous union because she's still married to the first husband. There never was a divorce. So children of that second pseudo-marriage are mamzers, right? A child born of an adulterous relationship, and they can't marry other Jews who are not mamzers. So it's a really, really big deal. And of course, if a couple is getting divorced under Jewish law, the normal thing is that you go to a beis din and the rabbis advise you and you make sure that every T is crossed, every I is dotted, or let's say every aleph is complete, every base is complete. But you do everything correct so that there's no issue, no chance that this could come up. And it's really not a difficult thing to do. Just takes some time. It takes some care. It's emotionally fraught. Of course, no divorce is easy. But you just make sure that you do it correctly. So today we're going to talk about what happens if you don't do it correctly. Okay, Mishnah number 5. We're about halfway down the page on 79b. Beis Shammai say, a man may send, meaning divorce his wife, with an outdated bill of divorce, and Beis Hillel prohibit him from doing so. And what is an outdated bill of divorce? It is any case where he was secluded with her after he wrote the get and before he gave it to her. Why is this an issue? They're not divorced until he gives her the get. But he might wait between the writing and the giving. The writing is when the get got a date on it, right? So if he wrote the get, decided not to give it to her at that time, the couple were secluded together, meaning they had marital relations. Perhaps she got pregnant. And then later they decided to go ahead with the divorce, and he hands her that get that he's had sitting in a drawer for a while. Well, the date of that get would indicate to some, to third parties that this couple had a child after they were divorced. Now, they didn't, because he didn't give her the get till later. But this is what becomes an outdated bill of divorce. And to make sure you're doing things properly, much better that you should create a new get at the time that you're actually going to get the divorce that will have a date that reflects the giving. The writing could be, a day or two different than the giving, but it shouldn't be some extended amount of time. And of course, the couple should not be having marital relations between the writing and the giving of the get. Now, this is one of those cases where Beis Hillel is more stringent than Beis Shammai. Usually Beis Shammai is more stringent. But the law here actually is like Beis Shammai. Let's continue reading the Gemara. The Gemara explains, with regard to what do they disagree, Beis Shammai hold that we do not say that the get is not valid due to a rabbinic decree, that it became outdated because they were secluded after it was written, lest they say that receipt of her get precedes conception of her son. Right? Beis Shammai are not concerned about that. They're not concerned about what other people will think. The fact is they weren't divorced until the get was given, so there was nothing inappropriate here. It just doesn't look right. There is concern. So if he gives her the get long after it was written, she may give birth to children from him in the interim. And there is a concern that people will say that she was actually divorced on the date written on the get before the children were born, and the children were conceived through licentious sexual intercourse. And Beis Hillel hold that we do say that this get is not valid due to the rabbinic decree, lest they say that receipt of her bill of divorce precedes the conception of her son. Right? In other words, Beis Shammai are not concerned that people might say that, and Beis Hillel are. And Rabbi Abba says that Shmuel says, even according to Beis Hillel, if the woman was married on the basis of an outdated get given to her by the previous husband, who did not ask advice from the rabbis, nonetheless, she need not leave her second husband. In such a case, this decree is not severe enough to invalidate the get. And there are those who say that Rabbi Abba says that Shmuel says if she was divorced with an outdated bill of divorce, this woman can marry even ab initio on the basis of this get. There is no requirement for her to wait for the first husband to write her a new bill of divorce with that later date. So, that is the law. If she went ahead and married based on that outdated bill of divorce, she doesn't have to divorce the second husband. She's going to be okay. It can even be used ab initio. It's better not to, but if they did rely on it, it's fine, even ab initio. So that flaw in the get is not a fatal flaw in the get, because truthfully, it might have been written sometime before it was given, but once it was given, they were completely separated, never had relations again, acted like people who are properly divorced, and she can marry based on that. She can remarry someone else based on that get. Now we go to Mishnah number 6, and we start to encounter the kinds of errors in the get that are fatal flaws for the second marriage. Mishnah number 6. If the husband wrote the date on the get using a calendrical system, a calendar, that counts years in the name of a kingdom that is not legitimate, or he wrote the date in the name of the kingdom of Media, or in the name of the Greek Empire after it ceased to exist, or he wrote the date counting to the building of the temple or counting to the destruction of the temple. In all these cases, the get is not valid. You would think that a get dated according to the number of years, since the construction or since the destruction of the temple, which is a date that's easily measured, right, in the Jewish world, why wouldn't that be legitimate, right? Or if you're talking about the Greek Empire, everyone in the world had heard of the Greek Empire. So you would know when when the last, let's say, Greek emperor ruled. And then you could date, the number of years since that happened, and to say, in other words, you could definitely date a get in a way that everyone would understand when that get was dated. But you are not permitted to use those kinds of dating systems on a get. Rather, you must use the dating system of the land and the era in which the inhabitants are living, right? So if they're in Israel when the Jews are sovereign in Israel, okay, so they can use the Jewish system. But if Jews are living, right, in the Roman Empire or in the Persian Empire or in England or France or wherever they are, the get needs to include, at least in ancient times, the get needed to include the date based on the local government in that place. This law has actually changed since then. A normal get will have the sort of date of the culture, but the more relevant date is actually the Hebrew calendar. And the reason for having the get be dated under local laws, the local government, non-Jewish government, will be explained soon. Now, if the husband was in the east and he wrote the location in the get as in the west, or if he was in the west and he wrote the location as in the east, the get is not valid. You have to say where the husband and wife are when the get is being given. That has to be written in the get. In other words, Jonathan the son of Abraham, of Pumbedisa, etc. Right? You have to say the cities where these people live, and if you mislabel the city, then the get will not be valid. If the husband divorced her with this get and she remarried, right, this get that was invalid because it used the wrong dating system or it didn't include the right location in the get, and so therefore was rendered invalid. So if she remarried based on an invalid get, and it was invalid because of these technical errors, then if she remarries based on that, she must leave both the first husband that she never was properly divorced from and the second husband, and she needs a proper get from both of them. And she does not receive payment of her marriage contract and not the profits from her properties that her husband consumed. And she does not have a claim to receive sustenance, and she does not have a claim to worn clothes that belong to her. These are all rights that a wife has that she would not have in that neither the second marriage nor the first, as a penalty for remarrying based on an invalid get. Right? Because the penalty is severe, she is going to go out of her way to make sure that the get was drawn up properly. To receive sustenance, and she does not have a claim to worn clothes that belong to her but which her husband had used. She cannot demand these items, not of the first husband and not of the second husband. If she took any of these items from this husband or from that husband, she must return what was taken. And the child that was born from this husband or from that husband that was conceived after she married the second husband is a son born from an adulterous relationship, a mamzer. And neither this husband nor that husband, if they are priests, is permitted to become ritually impure by her when she dies. Right? A priest can become tameh, ritually impure, to bury his wife, but since she's not properly his wife, not of the first husband nor of the second, because she relied on this invalid get, a priest is not permitted to become ritually impure to bury her. Other people can, but not the priest. And neither this husband nor that husband have the rights to objects that she finds, nor to her earnings, nor to annul her vows, because it's not a valid marriage. And if she was an Israelite woman, then through these two marriages, she becomes disqualified from marrying into the priesthood due to the prohibition of a priest marrying a zona, a woman who was in any kind of licentious relationship. Now we're actually on 80A. 80A. If she was the daughter of a Levite through these two marriages, she becomes prohibited from partaking of the tithe that is given to Levites. That's a very interesting and harsh penalty. Right? We know that a woman who's the daughter of an Israelite, like all other non-priests, cannot eat teruma. Only priests can eat teruma. When she marries, or if she marries a priest, then she may partake of teruma because she's a member of his household. That's teruma, the first tithe that people set aside when the temple is standing. It's the first 2% that goes to a priest. The next part of the tithing process is the tithe, the miser, that's given to the Levite, right? The 10th that's given to a Levite. Now, that is not consecrated food. It is mundane food, as it were, and anyone can eat it. You don't have to be a Levite to eat food that was tithed and given to a Levite. But this woman is penalized for having relied on an invalid get when she remarried. And so even though anyone else can eat the Levites' food, whether they're Levites or not, she cannot because she's penalized for marrying when she shouldn't have. If the woman, the daughter of an Israelite, if this woman was the daughter of a priest, she becomes prohibited from partaking of teruma even after she returns to the house of her father, the priest. Now, you might say, and I think it's a good question, I was wondering about it, why is she punished so harshly? Doesn't the husband write the get? So if the husband screwed up and gave her a get that was not valid in some way, why do so many penalties accrue to her? Right? Why is she the one that's responsible for checking this out? And the answer is because the husband's a jackass. I think that's the bottom line. The husband is a jackass. He is gonna, he doesn't want to be married anymore, and he's giving her the get. He can't be relied upon to make sure that the get was a proper get, because under Torah law, there's less at stake for him. He can remarry. He can marry another time, even if he wasn't divorced when he thought he was divorced, because he can have 2 wives under Torah law. Again, that's been outlawed for 1,000 years under rabbinic law, but by Torah law, a husband can have 2 wives. A wife cannot have 2 husbands. So if she thought she was divorced when she wasn't and remarried, that will create a mamzer. Lest that happen, she has all these penalties hanging over her head. So she's going to study that get very carefully and make sure that everything in there is correctly written. And then, since she's not an expert in the writing of gets, she's surely not, she will take that get to a rabbi, the rabbi who's going to perform the ceremony of her second marriage, and show it to him. And he will be somebody who's going to be careful to inspect that get is a proper get. So it's not just her. It's going to be her and the second husband. They will take it to the rabbi. They and the rabbi will make sure that everything about that get was proper before they get married, so that none of these penalties ever come to be. And the heirs of this husband and the heirs of that husband, her first and second husband, do not inherit the rights to collect payment of her marriage contract if she dies. And if the husbands die, the brother of this first husband and the brother of that second husband perform chalitza, since she was betrothed to the second one as well, and they do not consummate levirate marriage. So you cannot perform levirate marriage. You would have to do chalitza, the ceremony that releases one from the levirate obligation. Now, the Mishnah proceeds to teach an additional law concerning a get written not in accordance with its laws. If the husband changed his name, i.e. he wrote a different name in the get, or he changed her name, or if he changed the name of the city or the name of her city. Right? In other words, if the get was supposed to, be the document that shows that, Jonathan, the son of Abraham, divorced Rebecca, the daughter of Isaac, right? And then the correct names weren't on that get, or the correct residence cities were not on that get. So that's not a valid get. No good. You can't remarry based on that. We've said it 8 times. We'll probably said it another 8 times. So if he has the wrong name in the get or the wrong city in the get, and she remarried on the basis of this flawed get, then she must leave both the first husband and the second husband. And all of those above mentioned ways of penalizing a woman who remarried based on the get detailed in the earlier clause of our Mishnah apply to her in this case as well. And the Mishnah teaches another law associated with the previous laws with regard to all those cases in which they said that a man who died without children and left behind a widow who is to the man's brother one of those with whom relations are forbidden, right? So let's say that there's a couple, right? They're a married couple, and the husband dies, and he hasn't had children, but he had a brother, right? So now we know that she has to either marry that brother, and their first child is going to be considered the heir of the first husband, the brother who died without children, and then subsequent children will be considered the children and the heirs of the woman and the brother, right? The second marriage. Or she and the brother don't have to marry, then if they don't want to, but they must perform the chalitza ritual, and then they can go their separate ways. Now, an exception to this rule is, let's say that the surviving brother, he has his own wife, right? Now, again, under Torah law, a man can have more than one wife, so he can perform yibum with the dead brother's wife, and then he would have two wives. However, if two brothers married two sisters, right, so that when one of the brothers dies childless and he leaves a widow and he had a brother, but this widow cannot marry her yavam, right, the surviving brother, because that surviving brother is married to the widow's sister, and you can't be married to two sisters. Even under Torah law, where you can be married to two women, you can't be married to two sisters. And you might say, whoa, Jacob was married to Rachel and Leah. Well, he was married to Rachel and Leah before the Torah was given. After the Torah was given, you can't marry a man who's already married to your sister. So the only option would be chalitza. Actually, no. If it's a prohibited union, they don't even have to perform chalitza because not yibum was never on the table, so they're excused from chalitza as well. Okay, so that's the background to understand these laws now that are going to relate to the get, right? So the Mishnah teaches another law. With regard to all those cases in which they said that a man who died without children and left behind a widow, who is to the man's brother, one of those with whom relations are forbidden, for example, she is the surviving brother's wife's sister, like what I said. So not only is there no levirate bond for her, but the rival wives of the brother who died are also permitted to marry without either yibum or chalitza, right? So if the one who died had two wives, and one of his wives is the sister of the wife of the surviving brother. So yibum is off the table, chalitza is not necessary, not only for the widow whose sister is married to the surviving brother, but also for her co-wife, right? The co-wife, the one who died, had two wives. One of them, her sister's married to the surviving brother. The other one has no other relationship to the family except she's the widow of the one who died. But even she is excused from yibum or chalitza with the surviving brother because her co-wife exempts her. We studied all of these complicated laws in Tractate Yevamos. Okay, so with regard to that, right, so what is the point? With regard to all those cases in which they said that a man who died without children left behind a widow who is to the man's brother, one of those to whom that the rival wives are also exempted. But now why are we talking about a get? Well, these rival wives went and married another man without chalitza, which they're permitted to do. And these widows with whom the relationships were forbidden, right? So like there were two co-wives that became widows, and one of them, her sister's married to the surviving brother, and so that exempts both co-wives from having to perform chalitza or yibum. Okay, so then the one who was exempted went and married a guy. She was perfectly good to do that. Then it turns out that the one whose sister is married to the surviving brother, that widow, it turns out that she's an alonis, meaning a woman who was never sexually developed, right? She never had the possibility of having children because physically, it's like she never left puberty. She never passed through puberty, so she never was able to have a child, right? That's the case of the alonis. Now, what happens with an alonis is that since a man is obligated to reproduce, women are not obligated to have children. Men are. Women are not obligated because childbirth is dangerous, and they're not obligated to do something that could endanger them. But a man is obligated to go and find a woman, marry her, and father children. He may not be able to, but he has to keep trying. So, if a man marries an alonis, a woman who's incapable of having children, so the marriage is considered to be in error, right? It's considered to be in error. That's what's going to be the underlying principle here. So listen. So these rival wives went and married another man without chalitza, and these widows with whom the relationships were forbidden were found to be an alonis, or one of them was found to be an alonis. Therefore, it became clear retroactively that the marriage to the dead brother was never valid. And accordingly, the rival wives were never exempt from the obligation of yibum due to their being the co-wives of a forbidden relationship. Consequently, the co-wives were forbidden to go and marry anyone else without chalitza, and the co-wives must leave both this man whom they remarried and that yavam, they cannot enter, i.e. they cannot enter into yibum with him. And all of those above mentioned ways of penalizing a woman who remarried based on the get detailed in the earlier clause of the Mishna apply to her in this case as well. Now note, they're not talking about a woman who it just turns out is not able to have children. That, she's sterile for some reason. They're talking about somebody who, physically never leaves puberty, right? And that's something that they would know if they would just wait a few years, right? So they married at a very young age, and if they would just wait a little bit of time, they would see, oh, she's an alonis. We can't rely on her to exempt us from chalitza. And if there's any doubt about it, they could just perform the chalitza to make sure that there won't be an issue, and then they can go off and marry. And they didn't do that. They weren't careful about it. The sages are extremely punctilious and stringent about even, situations that could create a mamzer. And that's why they demand that these couples be very careful when there's a potential to create a mamzer situation later, to do all of the footwork, as it were, to make sure that that situation will never come up. Similarly, with regard to one who marries his yavama, right? So the widow marries the surviving brother. They perform yibum, and she had a co-wife who went and got married to another man. And it was found that the yavama, the one who married the surviving brother who performed yibum with him, it was found out that she was actually an alonis. So now the co-wife must leave her man that she married, that in her second marriage, and the yavam is off limits to her because the yavama was a sexually underdeveloped woman. She was an alonis. The obligation of yibum never applied to her, and her levirate marriage did not exempt her co-wife. And all of those aforementioned ways of penalizing a woman who remarried based on a flawed get apply to these women as well. Now the Mishnah now discusses another case. A scribe wrote a get for a man so that the man could divorce his wife with it, and he wrote a receipt for the woman for her to give to her husband upon receiving payment of her marriage contract, verifying that she received the payment. And the scribe made a mistake. He wrote the documents properly. He wrote the get properly, and he wrote that receipt for payment of the ketubah properly. But the mistake he made is he handed the get to the woman, and he handed the receipt, wait a minute. And the scribe made a mistake, and he gave the get to the woman and the receipt to the man. And not knowing what was written in the documents that were in their possession, they gave what they received from the scribe to each other. So the woman received the get, and the husband received the receipt. Thinking he was giving his wife a get to divorce her, he actually gave her the receipt that she would have given him when he paid the ketubah payment, that he became liable to when they divorced. And she, thinking that she was giving him a receipt for payment, actually handed him the get that he was supposed to have given to her, right? So because they didn't know which document was in their hand, and they didn't, go through the proper process of getting divorced, they're not divorced. That's what happened. They thought they're divorced, and they're not. And they gave what they thought was the correct document to the other. So they're obviously not divorced. And after some time, the get is in the possession of the man, and the receipt is in the possession of the woman, and they realize that the divorce never actually transpired. So if during that time the woman had remarried another man, she must leave both the first husband and the second husband, and all of those penalties that we mentioned earlier in the Mishnah would apply to her. And Rabbi Lazar says, if the get is immediately in the husband's possession, this is not a valid get, since he clearly never gave it to her. But if it is found in his possession after some time, then this is a valid divorce. And since it is not in the power of the first husband to eliminate the right of the second husband, the assumption is that the husband did in fact give her the get properly, but at some point the document ended up in his possession and we don't know how, so we don't assume that the divorce was improper. That is actually one of the longer Mishnahs we've read, but that was Mishnah number 6. Here comes the Gemara. It was stated in the Mishnah that if one wrote the get according to a kingdom that is not legitimate, it is not valid. And so the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of the description, a kingdom that is not legitimate? Right? That you can't use the dating system of this kingdom that is not legitimate. Now, this is a surprise. And the Gemara answers, this is referring to the Roman Empire. And he wrote the get in a different country, such as Babylonia, where the Romans were not in power. Okay, so you can't use the Roman calendar, even though everyone in the world would know back then what the Roman calendar said. But if the couple's living in Bavel, in Babylonia, where it's part of the Persian Empire, they can't use the dating system of the Roman Empire to write a valid get. Okay, we understand that. You can't use a foreign government, their dating system. And remember, back in ancient times, it's not like there was a universal calendar that everyone around the world used, right? Every kingdom had its own calendar based on the number of years, since the king ascended to the throne, something like that. Okay, so understand you can't use a foreign government's dating system. But why would you say that the Roman Empire is not a legitimate kingdom? I mean, that was a big empire, right? I mean, they took other countries by force. You could say that they, were unethical, immoral. But in terms of being a world power that everyone, respected, and certainly that the Jews in the land of Israel would not want to get in trouble by, the Jews, like in the Jerusalem Talmud, you're never going to find a reference to the Roman Empire as the illegitimate kingdom. But why would they say that in Babylonia? I mean, there's problems with the Romans for sure. But would you call them an illegitimate kingdom? Very interesting, right? What is the meaning of the description of a kingdom that is illegitimate? And the Gemara answers, this is referring to the Roman Empire. Not only because they wrote this get in Babylonia, which was not part of the Roman Empire, but they actually refer to the Roman Empire as illegitimate for a deeper reason. And why is it called a kingdom that is not legitimate? Because they have neither their own script nor their own language, but rather they took them from other nations. I'm sure Bill knows all about this. For the rest of us, this was news to me. What do you mean the Romans don't have their own alphabet? Isn't Latin the Roman language? Isn't Latin the national language of the ancient Roman Empire? Not so fast. This assertion is based on Roman history. Latin, the language used by the Romans, was originally the language of the Latins, a nation and country that the city of Rome assimilated and incorporated within it. And the Roman alphabet is primarily based on the Etruscan alphabet with the modifications of the Latins. And despite their military and political power, enormous as it was, the culture of the Romans was essentially borrowed from other nations. Pretty interesting. Ula said, for what reason did the sages institute that the date on a get should be written according to the years of the local kingdom? due to the need to maintain peaceful relations with the kingdom, as the government is particular that important documents issued in its domain be written with the date of that government, right? Now, in modern times, we're used to the fact that, okay, if a Jewish couple is getting married, they're going to have a ketubah and they're going to have a get if sadly they get divorced. But that's not the only documentation of their marriage, right? They also have a marriage license that they get from their state or their, or their municipality. And if they get a divorce, they're going to have to register that with the American government or the state government, etc. But you can see that in ancient times, each community was going to be responsible for creating its own documents, and that's going to be the document. And so that document has to show respect for the government that has power over that community, right? And so the sages were very careful to maintain peaceful relationships with the governing authority, They weren't, unfortunately, careful enough about that in Israel. I mean, we're thinking about the Bar Kokhba rebellion, even 65 years later after the destruction of the Second Temple, when they rebelled, a very ill-advised rebellion against Rome that resulted in a genocide of the Jews in the ancient land of Israel, and that really was the end. Some Jews remained, for sure, but 1 million perished, and they salted the earth, etc. The danger of not maintaining friendly relations with a harsh and powerful authority, well, it's obvious. Now the Gemara asks, but due to an ordinance instituted by the sages solely for the sake of maintaining peaceful relations with the kingdom, would the sages be so stringent that the woman would be forced to leave her second husband and they would declare the status of their offspring a mamzer? And the Gemara answers, yes. Right? They're saying that you have to date that get using the dating system of the local government. So in Bavel, it's the Persian Empire, and you have to date that get according to the dating system of the Persian Empire. And the Gemara is asking, and are you telling me that if they didn't use the dating system of the Persian Empire on a Jewish get in Hebrew, meant to regulate the the marriage and the relationships and the lineage of Jews in a Jewish community, that because they left out the Persian date, you're going to say that get is flawed? So much so that if she remarried, she has to end that marriage, leave that second husband, and any children that they had are declared mamzers just because you want to have peaceful relations with the Persian Empire? Answer, yes. That's how important it is. Rabbi Meir conforms to his line of reasoning. As Rav Hamnuna says in the name of Ula, Rabbi Meir would say that anyone deviating from the formula coined by the sages for a get, even if it is only a minor deviation, the get is not valid. And if the woman remarried on the basis of this flawed get, then the offspring from the second marriage, which was not a marriage, is therefore a mamzer. And it was stated in the Mishnah, if the husband wrote on the get in the name of the Greek Empire, then the get is not valid. And the Gemara comments, and it is necessary to state the law and this law and the other law as well, as if the Mishnah had taught us this law only with regard to a kingdom that is not legitimate, that used the Roman Empire's dating system while you're in Bavel, one could say that the get is invalid because this kingdom, Persia, is currently ruling, and the local government where he is writing the get would be offended, right? Would object to the writing of the date of another kingdom that's on their border, right? I mean, certainly the Persian Empire doesn't want to see a get dated with the Roman Empire dating. But with regard to the kingdom of Media or the Greek Empire, which are extinct kingdoms, maybe the Persians wouldn't care because, in fact, they might be tickled by it. Since the Greek Empire is an empire that they defeated and took all their lands. So maybe the Persians wouldn't care about that, and so you might be able to use the Greek Empire's dating system or the Median Empires. But the sages said, no, we tell you how to date it, and you follow what we say. And the Mishnah taught us this law with regard to the kingdom of Media and the Greek Empire. One could understand the concern because they were kingdoms, and the current government objects to another kingdom being mentioned in a document. But if he wrote the date counting from the building of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem or since the destruction of the temple. So what does the Persian Empire care that you're dating your get based on an event in Jewish history? We're not offending the Persian Empire by using the dating system of some other empire. So you might think that that would be allowed, but it's not. They want the gets to be standardized, and you have to follow the decrees of the sages in creating the get. Now, it was stated in the Mishna that if he was in the east and he wrote the location in the get as in the west, then the get is not valid. And the Gemara asks, who is the Mishnah discussing? If we say that the place of the husband was changed, then this is the same as what was stated later in the Mishnah. He changed his name or her name, the name of his city, or the name of her city. What difference does it make whether he's in the east, he wrote that they're in the east, and actually they're in the west, or vice versa? If the city is wrong, then it's wrong. And rather, is it not referring to the scribe who changed the place in which the bill of divorce was written and did not record the correct location where he was when he wrote the get? As Rav said to his scribes, and similarly Rav Huna said to his scribes, when you are situated in a place called Shili, write the location of the document as in Shili, even though the matters were presented to you, i.e. the transaction recorded in the document took place somewhere else, like a place called Hini. And when you are situated in Hini, you the scribe, so you write in the document in Hini, even though the matters that are being discussed in that get pertain to a couple that lives in Shili. Right? In other words, if Tom and Jane who want to get a divorce, they live in Shili, but there are no scribes in Shili, so instead they go to Hini, so where there is a scribe. So when they stand before the scribe in Hini and tell him that they live in Shili, you might think that that scribe would write, so and so of Shili, from that other city. But rather, he says, no, maybe he might say that they who live in that city appeared before me in my city, and we wrote the get here in my city, and this is where the divorce happened. Now, Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, and now we're on 80b, this is the statement of Rabbi Meir, who is particular about maintaining peaceful relations with the kingdom with regard to the get. But the majority, the rabbis, say even if he wrote a date on the get only in the name of the guardsman, the santar in the city, she is divorced, since it is irrelevant which calendrical system was used for the date. What? They're not particular? Only Rabbi Meir is particular? What is the law? The halacha. The case in question relates to a person who wrote the date on a get, and the date was determined using a calendrical system that referred to a government that was not in power in the locale where the get was written. A similar question applies to a person who wrote the date on a get, and the date was written counting the number of years from the building or the destruction of the temple. In either of these situations, the get is valid if it is customary for people in that locale to count the years in this manner. And if they do not ordinarily count in this manner, then the get is not valid. And the law is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. Nevertheless, even according to the rabbis, the get is invalid ab initio. You should not use such a get. You should get it properly written. If you relied on it anyway and remarried, they're not going to make you undo the second marriage, but you shouldn't have done that. In all cases, if you're getting a divorce, consult with your local Orthodox rabbi. It is related that there was a certain get in which the date was written in the name of the governor of the city of Baskar, meaning the date was marked according to the years of his government. That was what they did in that locality. So Rav Nachman bar Rav Chisda sent this dilemma before Rabbah. What is the law in a case like this? And he sent him in response, with regard to this, even Rabbi Meir concedes that the get is valid. And what is the reason? The governor is an official from that kingdom, so the ruler of the kingdom does not mind. You might be in the Persian Empire, but if your local governor or representative of the Emperor of Persia says that all of the gets, written in this area are going to be dated from the date on which the governor assumed power in that region, then that's what we follow. And the Gemara asks, and in what way is this case different from the guardsman in the previous case? And the Gemara answers, there it is demeaning for them that the date is written in the name of an unimportant official. Here, with regard to the governor, it is complimentary for them that the date is written in the name of a senior official. And Rabbi Abba says that Rav Huna says that Rav says. This Mishnah is in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Meir, who is more stringent, who is stringent with regard to this get and holds that the child is a mamzer. But the rabbis say the lineage of the offspring is unflawed. And the rabbis concede to Rabbi Meir that if he changed his name or her name, the name of his city or the name of her city, then the offspring is a mamzer. Rav Ashi says we too learn in the Mishnah, if he changed his name or her name, the name of his city or the name of her city, and she remarried on the basis of this get, then she must leave both this husband and that husband. And in all those ways of penalizing a woman that we mentioned in the Mishnah apply. Is it necessary to clarify who teaches this law? If we say that it is Rabbi Meir, let him combine the case of one who writes a different kingdom and the case of one who changes the name, and teach them both as one law. Rather, conclude from it that the law is the opinion of the rabbis. And the Gemara conclude from it that until this point, the Mishnah was quoting the statement of Rabbi Meir. But after that, in the Mishnah, it is the statement of the rabbis that disagree with Rabbi Meir, that in the case of such a fundamental change, even in their opinion, such a get is not valid. New subject. It was taught in the Mishnah that in all of those cases in which they said that a man who died and left behind a widow who is to the yavam, one of those with whom relations are forbidden, and the co-wives were thought to be permitted to remarry, if it later became clear that the forbidden relation was an alonis, and therefore they were in fact forbidden from remarrying, then the co-wife who didn't perform chalitza or yibum, who needed to do that, she was relying on her own co-wife who was prohibited, who was exempt from yibum and chalitza, and she's exempt and she exempts her co-wives, but then it turned out that she wasn't exempt because she was an alonis and that marriage was considered not a marriage. So the co-wife who remarried wasn't permitted to remarry without chalitza. She should have checked out the situation before she went and remarried. She needed to have made sure, but she didn't, right? So in that situation, then they must leave, the co-wife who remarried must leave the man whom they remarried, and they cannot enter into yibum with the original brother, the yavam, and many other penalties apply to them as well. And the Gemara comments, it is possible to deduce from the language used by the Mishnah that only if they married other men, then yes, these laws apply to them. But if the rival wives engaged in licentious sexual intercourse, then no, these laws do not apply to them. Interesting, right? Like these penalties apply because she married. If she's a single woman who has sex with a man, that's licentious sexual intercourse, and it's an aveira. And when the temple is standing, you bring a sacrifice for that if you did it unintentionally, and it requires atonement if you did it intentionally. But since they didn't remarry based on a flawed get or on a flawed understanding of who needs to perform chalitza or not, it's not that later when they do get the chalitza and then remarry that they would have to, leave the second husband. The licentious sexual intercourse is a sin, but it doesn't trigger these other penalties. Now the Gemara suggests, let us say that this is a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rav Hamnuna. Because Rav Hamnuna says, a widow awaiting her brother-in-law to perform yibum, who engaged in licentious sexual intercourse, is likened to a married woman who committed adultery, and she is prohibited from entering into yibum with her yavam. Now the Gemara rejects this. No, this is not a refutation of that law, since it is possible to explain that the Mishnah gave the example that they married, and the same is true in a case where they engage in licentious sexual intercourse. And this is what the Mishnah is teaching. If they married, that phrase is used because it employed a euphemistic expression to refrain from discussing the case of licentiousness. And there are those who say that the exchange went a different way. It was like this. From the Mishna's statement about the co-wives that remarried, one can understand that the law is so that if they married, and the same is true in a case where they engaged in licentious sexual intercourse. The Gemara suggests, let us say that it supports the opinion of Rav Hamnuna. As Rav Hamnuna says, a widow waiting her brother-in-law to perform yibum, and she engaged in licentious sexual intercourse with him, right? If she does that, if she has sexual intercourse with her yavam, well, then they just perform yibum. So it must mean that she had sex with somebody else before she had performed chalitza with her yavam. That makes it licentious sexual intercourse. And after that, she cannot marry her yavam because it's like she cheated on him, because it's like she cheated on the levirate bond that they have. She'll still need to perform chalitza with him before she can go and legitimately marry some other person. But now that she had sex while she was awaiting her yavam, she cannot marry her yavam. Now the Gemara rejects this. No, it is in terms of applying it to our penalties in our Mishnah. Let us say that it supports the opinion. No, it is specifically when they married that they are forbidden, because she is confused with a woman whose husband traveled to a country overseas and she went and remarried. In that case, she is certainly prohibited from marrying both the first and second husband. Similarly, they instituted the same decree for a yavama who married someone else. By contrast, in the case of a yavama who engaged in licentious sexual intercourse, which is completely different, she has her own transgression to deal with, but she doesn't have to deal with the penalties listed in our Mishnah. New subject. It was taught in the Mishnah that one who marries his yavama and her co-wife went and married another man, and ultimately the yavama was found to be an alonis, then the co-wife must leave her husband. She cannot enter into yibum with the yavam, and many other penalties apply to her as well. And the Gemara comments, and it was necessary to teach this law as well, although it seemingly deals with the same issue as the previous law. As if the Mishnah taught us this law only with regard to the first case of a rival of a co-wife of a woman who is forbidden to the Yavam, then one could say that the law is so because the mitzvah of yibum was not fulfilled at all, since the co-wife married someone else and the Yavam did not perform yibum. But here, in this second case, where the mitzvah of yibum was fulfilled in some way when he married the yavama, although ultimately became clear that it was not a legitimate yibum, say that the co-wives are not penalized since she is not guilty by not having waited. I am just about done. If you got any questions or comments, please get them in now. And if the Mishnah had taught us this law here with regard to a Yavam who married a Yavama who was ultimately found to be an alonis, then one could say that specifically here there is reason to penalize her because this co-wife who remarried was also placed before the Yavam, as he could have entered into Yibum with any of the brother's wives. Therefore, she could have waited to see if the Yibum was effective before remarrying. But there, in the case of a Yavama who is forbidden to the Yavam, that she is not placed before him, as all of them are entirely exempt from yibum, say that the rival wives would not be penalized. Therefore, the Mishnah had to teach both cases because they are penalized in that situation. If you found the application of invalid get penalties, applying those penalties to a Yavama and her co-wife who didn't wait the amount of time to make sure that the co-wife who exempts was actually a legitimate exemption, don't feel bad because that is very confusing body of law. So if you found that confusing, very normal. Okay, few questions on Gittin, page 80. Sharon. As with a woman who is widowed, does the woman have to wait 3 months after the divorce before remarrying to be sure of paternity of any subsequent children? Yes. Jonathan, I wonder if a get is legal in the U.S. or whether a civil divorce is required. As far as I know, a get doesn't qualify as a civil divorce, and you would need to go through the civil divorce process. From the people that I know who've gone through this, the get is quick. A couple that decides to divorce can have a get in a few days. Civil divorce, months, years. Takes much longer to wind your way through the American legal system. A get can be obtained much more quickly. Ifa. If the one the wife hires to verify the get makes a mistake, verifying the invalid get, is the wife still held responsible and penalized? Boy, is that a good question. Boy, is that a good question. She did what she was supposed to do. She didn't assume that she's a sage, that her her knowledge of the law of the get is sufficient. She didn't go and get some street corner rabbi that you could hire for $10 to examine the get, but she hired a proper expert and paid the proper fee for a proper expert to analyze everything and make sure that everything was done correctly. And then that guy made a mistake. Then what? I don't know what the answer to that is, but boy, does my heart hope that since she followed the law meticulously, she should be protected by the law. And in that situation, they would let her stay with the second husband and somehow, retroactively create a get or something, because she did what was appropriate. And we have seen other cases, for example, right, if a husband goes on a trip overseas, right? Now, if only a single witness comes back and says that they saw that husband die, and she remarries based on the testimony of a single witness, and then it turns out the husband wasn't dead and he returns from overseas. Okay, so her second marriage is invalid and she has to leave the second husband, and she needs a get from both the second husband and the first husband. And if there were children from the second husband, they're mom's. And that's because she relied on the testimony of a single witness. But if she relies on the testimony of two witnesses, which is proper testimony, and she remarries, and then it turns out that both of those witnesses were wrong. They saw a guy die who looked just like her husband and maybe had the same name. They had reason. It's not that they were lying. They made a mistake. And she relied on that testimony of the two witnesses, and then she remarried. Then the second marriage is valid. And she could stay with the second husband because the law was followed properly. So I'm hoping that a woman who relies on an expert to tell her that everything was done correctly, and it turns out that the expert was wrong, I hope it would be analogous to that situation of a woman who relies on two witnesses to say that her first husband died. So even though they made a mistake, she's protected. I would hope that it goes in that similar way, but I'm not sure. And I can take one more question. Aoife asks, in the case of the newlywed and widowed alonis, where the widows must wait for years to verify her status before being able to remarry, who sustains them during the waiting period? Wonderful question. I think we saw elsewhere that a yibum does. Now remember that when a brother, this husband who died childless, leaving a widow, he doesn't have a child, so he has no heir. So who is his heir? The brother, right? So the brother who has a bond with his yavama does sustain her until they either get married and he becomes his wife, or they perform chalitza and she goes her separate way. Until then, while they have that levered bond, that brother does have to sustain his yavama, and he can use the proceeds of the estate that he inherited from his brother to do that. Pretty sure I remember it being that way. That's what I've got for us today. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. And then that will be the last class for 9 days. We're going out of town for a family reunion. We'll not be able to teach from where we're going to be. So tomorrow we'll have class, and then we won't have class again until Friday of the following week. And at that point, we're going to do a couple of highlights shows, pretty soon after we resume, and get ourselves back on the Daf Yomi schedule. I know we've been running a few days behind, but we'll do a highlight show and kind of cruise through and get ourselves caught up. So regular show tomorrow, and then we're going to take some days off. Have a great night.